Welcome to the doghouse. Hope you're all having a great day. This is going to be a little different, but this is going to be about I am not ashamed of who I am. Nobody should be ashamed of who they are. Yes, we all can improve and need to realize we got to take that step to improve ourselves. But that don't mean we try to be somebody we are not. I am not ashamed of who I am or what I have done in life. I've come a long ways and a long ways to go. I'm not ashamed I grew up on ranches. I'm not ashamed of the hard work I had to do as a child, which most kids could have never done. Anybody working on a ranch will understand that. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not ashamed I grew up literally out in the middle of nowhere. I'm not ashamed of my childhood. I am not ashamed of my parents because they raised me right. I'm not ashamed of who I am, and I will not cower down to anybody in disgrace of myself. That will never happen. And it should never ever happen to any of you out there. I'm not ashamed of my brothers and sisters, and yes, I have a lot of them. Matter of fact, my mom had 10 kids and my dad had 2 others before he married my mom. So we're from a really big family. And I am not ashamed of that. Here's things about me, and there's many, many more than me out there. I've never been on welfare. I've always gone out and worked my butt off to get what I got. I don't have a lot, but I do have stuff. But still, I will not be ashamed of who I am or how I got here. We too much in our lives are ashamed of what we have accomplished because maybe we wanted to accomplish more and we haven't done it. That's just a goal you can set for yourself. Don't be ashamed you didn't accomplish it because you're still working at it. And it don't matter what your age is. This is something we all need to do. Don't be ashamed of who you are. Because of who you are, this world has gone around. The only way you should be ashamed of yourself if you're in a position of hate, disgust, and destruction. That's a little different. But I am not ashamed of who I am or my life's work. And it is a life's work. I'm not ashamed to get on here and say, I am glad who I am. I am glad for my parents. I am glad that I am here this day. I will never take a back seat to anybody when it comes to whether I'm ashamed of myself or not. I'm not ashamed. I am not ashamed of myself. I will never be ashamed of myself. I just will grow and grow. I will not cower down to people that try to push me down, walk over me, because that will not happen. Why? Because I'm not ashamed of who I am. You should never be ashamed of who you are. We all need to recognize the improvements in our lives we need to make. Every one of us needs to do that. That does not mean you need to be ashamed of yourself. Don't be ashamed of yourself. Look around. Look at your family. Look at the progress you have made throughout your life. Don't be ashamed of that. Improvement's always needed, but don't be ashamed of who you are or what you are. Be a positive person. Be loving to yourself. Don't let others put you down, because all that does is, when that happens, is somebody trying to make sure they are better than you. Don't let them do that. Don't be ashamed of who you are. A bully wants you to be ashamed of who you are. A narcissist thinks you're somebody you're not, but don't cower down to either one. Do not be ashamed of who you are. Look at the things we have accomplished in life. I was married, I'm still married, and I'm not ashamed of that. I'm not ashamed of my wife. I'm not ashamed of anything else. I have a positive attitude towards life itself. Yes, I can have a temper, and I've been accused all my life of maybe being a little stubborn, but I still am not ashamed of who I am. I'm not ashamed of my parents for raising me like they did. I have no regrets on that at all. If mistakes were made, it was because of me. But I'm still not ashamed of who I am. I spent many hours riding a bus to junior high and high school, but I am not ashamed of that because of the friends I met and the people I know. I'm not ashamed of them at all. I will never be ashamed of myself. Never be ashamed of who you are. Don't let people drag you down in the dirt, run you over, and so it makes you feel ashamed of yourself. Never be ashamed of who you are. A lot of people will try that with you, to drag you down and walk over you and just make fun of you because they're ashamed of who they are, and they need to take you down with them and feel the same way they do. Don't let them do it. Stay positive. Go forward in life. Be yourself. Don't be ashamed of who you are. Don't be ashamed of your parents or whoever raised you. Don't be ashamed of the hard work you've had to do. Don't be ashamed if you don't have as much money as somebody else. Don't be ashamed of who you are. You worked very hard to get where you are today. Don't be ashamed of that. Don't put yourself in a position you're ashamed of yourself. Be grateful who you are. Stand up for who you are. And always go forward because of who you are. Never ever let somebody push you down and try to get you to be ashamed of who you are. Yes, I'm repeating a lot, but I want to get the point across. We need all to stand up for who we are. We don't need to be ashamed of who we are. We were put on this earth for a reason, and we should not be ashamed of why we are here. And you cannot accomplish what you're put here on this earth for if you decide you're going to be ashamed of who you are. Yes, we all get knocked down in that sense, but we have to realize what is going on and move forward. Don't be ashamed of who you are for anybody. Don't think you need to be ashamed because you don't. Don't be ashamed of who you are. Be positive. Let life live its fullest. Don't live in fear that somebody might not like you because you are doing the right thing. I will never be ashamed of myself. And like I said earlier, and this comes from somebody that even at my age, 65, I still need to improve, and I will. That don't mean I'm ashamed of myself. That means I recognize something that needs to improve. I'm not ashamed of who I am or what I stand for. I will never, ever be ashamed of myself for the things I've done. We all learn, we all do bad, we all do good. But one thing we should never do is be ashamed of ourselves. I'm not ashamed of who I am. You should not be ashamed of who you are. Positivity will always get you farther in life, and you cannot be ashamed of yourself to achieve that. Always remember you are the person that controls yourself and your actions, and you shouldn't be ashamed of your actions. You really shouldn't. Yeah, we all do stupid things, like I said, and we need to improve. But don't be ashamed of who you are, because them stupid things we do in life gives us improvement we need to do, and we do it. That's nothing to be ashamed of. That's you being you and doing what you know you need to be done. I've been around so many people that are ashamed of themselves for no reason. They let people put them down, run over them. They've been around bullies and narcissists, and they have been knocked down so bad that they are ashamed of who they are because of the consequences others has done. You're still responsible for your own actions. Even when you're getting pushed down, you have to fight twice as hard to achieve what you want to achieve. Don't be ashamed of that. Don't be ashamed of who you are. I will never be ashamed of who I am. You should not either. We all run across people all our lives, and we will until the day we die, that hate you because you are not ashamed of yourself. You're positive and you're doing what you know is right. People hate that, and they will despise you for that. That don't mean you need to cower down to them and be ashamed of who you are. Never, ever be ashamed of yourself. And I'll say it again. We all need to improve on life, regardless of age. That don't mean we need to be ashamed of who we are. We should never, ever be ashamed of who we are. I know people on here that has been dragged down in the dirt for purpose of making money or content. They should never be ashamed of who they are. They should always step up and be who they are, because that's the way people like it. That's the way bullies and narcissists like it. When they can, because they hate themselves so bad, they would love to see you knocked down to their level. They want you to be ashamed of who you are. They want you to regret who you are. Their hate within themselves are so bad, they want to take you down to their level, and even people, your neighbors or whoever, may try to do the same thing, because bullies and narcissists hate themselves so bad they don't want to see anybody improve. They want you to hate yourself as much as they hate themselves. Never go down that road. Never. Don't let them get away with it. You are a better person than that. Your positivity will show a shining light on the negativity of bullies and narcissists. You will never, ever have to be that way like they are, because you will not be ashamed of who you are. You should never be ashamed of who you are. Always remember that you're the one in charge, not the bully or the narcissist. which means you should never be ashamed of who you are. You shouldn't hide in the corner because you're ashamed of who you are. Step forward, come out positively, and show the world you are not ashamed of yourself. When you start to be ashamed of yourself, and all of us get to a point we start to do this, we feel ashamed for ourselves, our heart starts to get hard. But when we realize that we should never be ashamed of ourselves, we reverse what is happening. And what I mean by reversing it, we go from not being positive and falling into the trap that we should be ashamed of who we are. But we catch it and we realize we should never be ashamed of who we are. No one in this world should be ashamed of who they are. Yeah, we all run into people we really don't care for a lot, but we should still never be ashamed of who we are. We're not perfect people on this earth, or never will be. But guess what? We should never be ashamed of ourselves. Can you imagine God looking down upon you and you're saying, God, I'm ashamed of myself. I shouldn't even be here. He would probably look at you and say, well, maybe you need to improve, but don't be ashamed of who you are. Yeah, if you're a bully, a narcissist, you probably should be ashamed of who you are, but the majority of the people should never ever be ashamed of who they are. They should have a positive attitude and go forward. I am not ashamed of who I am at all, and I'll flat out admit it. I will never be ashamed of who I am. I may not live the easiest life in the world, but I'm still not ashamed. I'm not ashamed of like I said earlier, where I was raised, and it really was out in the middle of nowhere. I'm not ashamed of my friends. I'm not ashamed of the people I've come across, even if I didn't really care for them, because they didn't control whether I was ashamed of myself or not. I will always have a positive attitude towards me and others. No, I am not a narcissist. It's just that nobody should be ashamed of who they are. If we go around in our life being ashamed of who we are, we will never accomplish nothing. Yes, there's evil people out there that exactly want you to do that, accomplish nothing. And they will run over you for that reason. But the biggest thing you can do is realize that you should never be ashamed of yourself, and that will help in the long run. Never think for a minute that there's somebody out there that is not in the same boat as you. But when you have that positive attitude that you're not ashamed of who you are, you will move forward. If you cower down and all of a sudden think you're ashamed of who you are, there is no way you can progress forward until you get that out of your head. And yes, you can remove that out of your head and be positive and move forward. Don't be ashamed of who you are. Don't be ashamed how you grew up. Some of us grew up a little bit harder than others, and some of us have been given a silver spoon. That's not me, but there is people out there like that. Even regardless of how much money you have in your pocket, or millions you have, or $0, you still should never be ashamed of who you are and have a positive attitude to move forward in life. Don't ever take yourself for granted that you cannot improve, But improving don't mean you have to be ashamed of who you are. Don't be ashamed. A matter of fact, if you have children out there or your parents or whoever raised you, don't be ashamed of who you are. Go show them and say that I love you. I appreciate what you did for me. I am a proud person because of what you did. Because they are the ones that set the goals for you not to be ashamed of yourself. If you're ashamed of yourself, you probably are hurting the people that put you on this earth. Don't ever cower down to nobody. Be the person you are. Don't be ashamed of that person. And once again, we all can improve. I'm not saying we're all perfect people, because we're not. We have a lot of improvements to do. But if you're ashamed of who you are, it'll be a longer road to improve on what we need to improve on. When you're not ashamed of who you are, you will recognize what you need to change. You don't need to go down the road when that people try to put you down, being ashamed of who you are. I know, and there's many ways this happens, because maybe you don't have the money. You go into the store, you can't get what you want. People look at you. You don't have the best car, the best house. People look at you. You start to be ashamed of who you are. Don't let that happen. Don't be ashamed of your situation. You may not like that situation, but don't be ashamed of who you are. Because when you're not ashamed of who you are, you will go farther in life. We all have obstacles to do and achieve. We've all been put in a place where we don't want to be, every one of us. But that don't mean we have to be ashamed of who we are. We just need to go forward and show the world who we really are. We can't live in shame of who we are. We can't be embarrassed of who we are. We just have to move forward and be positive. And yes, I realize there's people out there that hate and are ashamed of who they are. And you can see it. Just take a look around you. You can tell them that are ashamed of who they are. And they shouldn't be. Nobody should be ashamed of who they are. Everybody can improve. Everybody needs to improve. We don't need to go out there and be ashamed at all. There is no reason for us to be ashamed of who we are. We need to stand up who we are, improve where we need to improve, and go forward. Those that become ashamed of who they are just sit there and spin their wheels and cannot go forward. And one of the reasons they cannot go forward because they are ashamed of who they are. When you're ashamed of who you are, if you're an evil person, you will be able to dictate to that person who is ashamed of who he is or she is. And that's what a lot of evil people do. They prey on them that are weak. And those that are weak are those that are ashamed of who they are. A weak person will be swept up really fast because these people already know that you hate yourself, you're ashamed of who you are, and they can just beat the point even deeper to reassure you that you do hate yourself and you will not be able to achieve in their minds, but you still can. You don't have to be embarrassed of who you are. I don't care what people try to pull off on you. You are better than that. There is no reason you need to be ashamed. No reason in this world that you need to be ashamed of yourself. Your positive attitude will not let you go down being embarrassed of yourself. Yeah, we do things we are embarrassed of ourselves. I don't mean this long-term stuff. We've all did stuff that we are embarrassed of in our life. We may not tell the world, but it is still there. We are a people in this country, in this world, do embarrass themselves. Sometimes funny, sometimes it's not. But that doesn't mean we should be ashamed of who we are. That other stuff is how we grow in life. The other stuff is how we decide right from wrong. But if we are ashamed of ourselves, we will take a step back, and it's harder to go forward. And we almost come to a stop when we become ashamed of ourselves. When you're not ashamed of yourself, you do recognize the wrongs that have occurred, and you will improve on them. That's why we should never be ashamed of who we are. I will never be ashamed of who I am. I love who I am. I realize improvements I need to do in life. No, might not be the sharpest person in the book or the best talker you'll ever see, but I'm not ashamed of who I am. You cannot make me ashamed of who I am. And everybody out there should have that same attitude. Be able to grow, recognize the faults we do, but never be ashamed of who we are. Because somebody will say, well, that don't make no sense. Yes, it does. Because you never should be ashamed of yourself, but you should always recognize the bad we do and the improvements we need to make. If you're not ashamed of yourself, you will recognize these. That's not a narcissistic view. That is a view of you know how to progress, how to improve yourself. And we all need to do that. I'm going to keep repeating that. But we shouldn't be ashamed of who we are. When you're not ashamed of who you are, you know how to improve yourself and correct the problems in life. When you're ashamed of yourself, you're just ashamed of yourself. You're not even look right from wrong because you put yourself in a bad spot. And sometimes it's really, really hard to get out of that spot when you are ashamed of yourself. Yes, people dig themselves out of that spot and become very positive people and people that are not ashamed of who they are. But it makes it hard when you go down that road and you are ashamed of who you are because people have told you things that aren't true. People have put you down. People walk over you day in and day out that you have done wrong. And when that happens, it does work on your nerves and work on your psychological end of your brain that you've done something wrong, that you should be ashamed of yourself. You can say, well, I'm ashamed I did this. That's all well and fine, but you still should never, ever be ashamed of who you are because you recognize the problem and you're willing to move forward. But when them people that get knocked down so much, ran over, and they are told that they should be ashamed of who they are, it may take them longer to get out of that hole. But if you're in that hole, be positive because 100% you can get out of that. Do not be ashamed of who you are. Never be ashamed of who you are. When you're down that hole and people are putting you down, you still have an opportunity to bring yourself up and not be ashamed of who you are. God didn't put you on this earth to be ashamed of who you are. He put you here for a reason. And yeah, sometimes we do get into the point where we are ashamed of ourselves, but we correct that and have a positive attitude and go down the right path. Nobody on this earth will ever make me ashamed of who I am. Nobody on this earth should ever make you ashamed of who you are. Your positivity in life is very, very important to you, your family, and friends. You cannot be ashamed of yourself sitting there looking at your children. Think about that. If you go down that road, you think you're ashamed. You're ashamed of yourself. Look at them kids. Are you saying you're ashamed you have them kids? No. You should be proud of that. You should love them, which you probably do. That means you cannot be ashamed of yourself. Don't look at yourself and say, I'm ashamed of myself. Look at your family. Look at your friends. Is it really that important not to be ashamed? You shouldn't be ashamed. You should never be ashamed of yourself. Look at what you brought into this earth. Look at the people around. When you're not ashamed of yourself, you will grow. Always remember, never be ashamed of who you are. Just like I said, look at your family. Never be ashamed of who you are. Because if you're ashamed of who you are, you're even questioning your own family and kids. Don't do that. Always remember, and never let people stomp you in the ground. Never be ashamed of who you are. Never be afraid to improve your own life. Just remember that. Never be ashamed of who you are. If anything in what I've said gets to you, just remember that. Never be ashamed of who you are.